I'm the president of Liftport Group, and we've been running this show, the DareGreatly Space podcast, since about October last year. So we've got quite a few in the cans. Pretty excited about that. If you're new to this, please take a look at both our youtube.com channel slash youtube.com/liftport. Take a look at our Discord channel, which doesn't get a lot of activity, but we're trying to build it out a little bit. And where's our Spotify? Here's our Spotify account. So go to Spotify, and if you don't want to click this link because it's impossible, go to DareGreatly Space on Spotify, and you should find several really great episodes. We have some more coming. I don't know how many we actually have on Spotify now, but we've got hundreds, no joke, hundreds on our YouTube channel. So both of those places are good places to find out what's going on. So our show really kind of breaks down to the three big topics: the money of space, space infrastructure, and policy. And within those three ideas, we have three kinds of shows. We have a space policy show where we kind of dissect core documents that are relevant to the space infrastructure community, commercial space community. So policy, news, current events, things that are happening now, and kind of try to do some analysis. And then guests. We have a lot of guests. We've had the Chief Scientist of U.S. Space Force, Lieutenant General, 3-star General Quast, 4-star General Salzman, the CSO of U.S. Space Force. Those are on the military side. We've had Lieutenant Colonel Anand something. Oh my gosh, I forgot his last name. Talking about how Space Force is investigating, he was the U.S. Army. How the U.S. Army Transportation Logistics Agency is looking at how to use things like Starship to transport troops. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. Mostly equipment right now. They're not looking at troops, I don't think. So on the military side, there's that. On the commercial space sector, we've had dozens of venture capitalists, senior leadership in many different companies. And then on the NASA side, we've had some really great folks over at NASA, mostly none that are active at NASA. That's actually something we've slightly done on purpose. Folks who are no longer constrained to talk about their days there. So that's what we've been doing. We've got some really cool guests coming up. The folks at Cislunar Industries are coming in at the end of the month. We've got some folks in from Gravitics and Starfish and Integrated Space. I've got a bunch of invitations out. We don't know that they're going to be accepted or not, so we have our fingers crossed about them. So lots of guests coming up. That's pretty neat. Pretty happy about that. Today is going to be a dig into policy, specifically the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miley, issued a report. It actually came out in February. I only saw it today. So not great distribution on that list, but it's cool. It's interesting. We're going to talk about it for a minute. To set that stage, let me go to an article. I pointed this out a couple days ago maybe it was 2 weeks ago. I pointed this one out 2 weeks ago. I'm bringing it back up a second time because it's really relevant to today's topic. So this is Goldman Sachs. You know that they're an analyst group monitoring all sorts of stuff, the health of the economy, individual stocks, investment banker to the super wealthy. So they did an analysis, and this was back May, so it's 2 months ago. The rise of geopolitical swing states. I'm going to read a couple of the first paragraphs. The report is fairly long, so I'm not going to get into that. I am going to touch on some points, but I want to bring it up in context with what we're going to be talking about in a moment. So give me a second. Posting that to the chat. This Goldman Sachs article is pretty interesting. I'm going to read some of the beginnings of this. As the US and China coexist, compete, and confront each other to determine who will set the geopolitical rules, they will either court or thwart an emerging group of countries to gain an edge. This new class of influential nations are the geopolitical swing states of the 21st century. These countries fall into four overlapping categories. 1, countries with a competitive advantage in a critical aspect of global supply chains. 2, countries uniquely situated for nearshoring, onshoring, friendshoring. 3, countries with a disproportionate amount of capital and willingness to deploy it around the world. And 4, countries with developed economies and leaders with global vision that they pursue within certain constraints. So this is kind of like, all right, there's two big nations in the world, and there's tension between them. It's a pretty interesting spot to be in. So I'm going to continue with their intro. In American domestic politics, swing states can be won by either party, and they decide presidential elections. In geopolitics, swing states have agency to chart their own course on an issue-by-issue basis, and they may decide the future of an international balance of power. I think that's pretty significant, and let that sink in for a second, right? That these nations, and I can think of a few that are pretty interesting in the space sector, that these nations have the ability to decide which kind of program, which kind of global politic status they want to embrace. And they might be smaller nations in the global scheme of things, but because of the tension between the US and China, if they pick one side or the other, it swings the balance of, quote, international balance of power. All right, I'm going to keep reading. They are relatively stable countries that have their own global agendas independent of Washington and Beijing, and the will and capabilities to turn those agendas into realities. They are growing more assertive in using their economic advantage to bolster their standing and influence. They are more demanding, flexible, dynamic, and strategic than they could have been in the 20th century. Whatever their shared interests with one great power or another. And they will often choose multi-alignment, a strategy that will make them critical and sometimes unpredictable forces in the world's next stage of globalization and the next phase of great power competition. Okay, so pretty interesting article, definitely worth a read. You know, we've used this phrase, great power competition, a couple times. Dr. Namrata Goswami has talked about quite a bit in her interviews with us. I'm in a disagreement with Dr. Rajawanias about whether or not we're in a space race with China. I think we are He thinks we are not, by the definitions of the last space race with the Soviet Union. I think when Washington, D.C. throws down the gauntlet and says that they're going to be first on a couple things, that by definition creates a space race. So I think it's interesting. So this document takes a look at who's doing what and why. This line, in the 2020s, everything is geopolitical. I mean, I wish it weren't, but I think it's true. It took a global pandemic, Russia's war on Ukraine, and the heightened U.S.-China competition for the fact that the old world of globalization is over to become undeniable. Each great power has a privileged position in the global economy, and they all face new risks and uncertain futures. The United States is leaning more into its status as the holder of the world's reserve currency, using the dollar and related payment systems to sanction adversaries and competitors. China is leveraging dependency on its position in supply chains. And Russia, with nowhere near the power of China or the US, but with more appetite for risk, has wielded energy to intimidate and coerce its neighbors and limit global support for Ukraine. There is no country or multilateral organization that has the capacity to arbitrate these tensions. All right, so I'm pretty sure you all know the world that we're living in. I just think that this is a really interesting article. It goes into some depth about some of the power that each of these smaller nations independently wield collectively, and what they might try to do. So definitely I recommend taking a look at this thing. I'm going to read the 4 categories again, but I'm going to go into depth in one. Countries with a competitive advantage in a critical aspect of global supply chains. I think that's pretty obvious. There's a lot of nations out there that the world depends on some of the products and services coming from them. Countries with a unique ability to make themselves attractive for nearshoring, onshoring, and friendshoring. That also, I think, is relatively straightforward. This is the one I want to get into. Countries with a disproportionate amount of capital and willingness to deploy it around the world in pursuit of strategic objectives. In their own language here, high energy prices in recent years have given the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC countries, significant opportunities, and the GCC's total wealth is expected to rise from 2.7 trillion to 3.5 trillion in just 3 years. All right, so that kind of paints a little of the picture here. I think you've all heard me say that United Arab Emirates has possibly the most impressive Martian plan of any group, any organization, any nation in the world. I don't think that they are necessarily getting the credit that they deserve, but it is this group from the GCC that is really, I think, spearheading a pretty tremendous path to the future. So I'm pretty excited about what they're doing. Reading further, part of their strategy is to go big at home. Giga projects like Nome in Saudi Arabia, that's their mega ultra city that's like 100 kilometers long in the middle of the desert. That's pretty wild. If you're not familiar with Nome, go take a look at it. It's mind-boggling. It is Saudi Arabia. It is Saudi Arabia's moonshot. Rather than go to the moon or something like that, like some other nations are doing, they are building a mammoth infrastructure, basically a 100-kilometer long, 10-kilometer wide or 2-kilometer wide city strip in the middle of the desert. It's remarkable. It's powerful. It upskills practically everyone in their nation. Everybody's going to be an engineer. Everybody's going to be a designer. Everybody's going to be in construction. They're putting their national workforce to work to build this thing, and they're going to upskill and invest and reinvest and reinvest. It's a remarkable system. So I'm going to read this again. Part of their strategy is to go big at home. Giga projects like NOM in Saudi Arabia and the World Cup in Qatar, and creating a business nerve center in the UAE are allowing them to differentiate themselves and attracting investment and talent. The second part of their strategy is to deploy capital abroad in ways to diversify their geographic touch points and calibrate with their expertise. The UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait are all actively investing in myriad locales like Latin America and Southeast Asia, India, and Africa. So going back to the UAE, they partnered with Korea. Before Korea created their own space agency, KESA, they had another group called, I think it's called CAST, but I'm not sure of that. And CAST is a mathematical think tank group. I think it's science and technology. Korea, something science and technology. So UAE partnered with CAST because they didn't want to go to Russia, they didn't want to go to China, and they didn't want to go to the United States. They chose Korea as their technical partner in the earliest days. Now, since then, they have definitely aligned with NASA, with the United States on several elements. I believe they were the first signatories to the Artemis Accords. But that's a direct point, right? Countries with disproportionate amounts of capital and willingness to deploy it around the world in pursuit of strategic objectives. We're starting to see that. We are. Norway, Luxembourg, to a lesser extent, the Czech Republic and Iceland, they're all aligning themselves with kind of a Western American path in space. And they all have wealth, and they're all deploying their capital to pursue this larger goal. So this is a longer paper. I don't want to go into all of it here. I just want to point it out as context for this next piece. Give me a second. Okay. Oh, thank you, Leah, about no. Yeah, it's remarkable. That thing is remarkable. As soon as I saw that thing exist, I saw it on paper about a year and a half ago. And I'm like, I think I'm going to quit working on the space elevator and go out to Saudi Arabia because that looks like a cool project. I think it's remarkable. Okay, let's move on to two other documents. Let me share screen here. Nope, that is not what I want. Start showing that. A couple days ago, I also mentioned that there was a policy paper that came out building U.S. Space Force counter space capabilities and imperative for America's defense. So keep that in mind and keep the article that we just read a moment ago about political swing states and the tensions between the U.S. and China. Again, I'm going to read. Space is on the front lines of America's strategic competition with China. Capabilities in this domain are essential to the U.S. military's ability to deter threats and project war-winning combat power. The United States has designed and sized its military forces, assuming they could depend on continuous access to space capabilities and efforts. This assumption is no longer valid. So this is a pretty long paper, and it goes into a lot of detail about what is a weapon in space. Do we have them already? What are they? Where are they? Who has them? What kind of architectures are needed? The pacing threat for U.S. Space Force. The number of potential adversaries able to threaten space systems and the sophistication and capacity of those threats are rapidly increasing. From widely available radio frequency jammers to co-orbital threats posed by Russia and China, the threat landscape is daunting. These threats are not speculative. They have already manifested. For example, in their invasion of Ukraine, Russia conducted cyber and RF jamming attacks to negate Ukraine's access to satellite communications and the GPS navigation and timing signals. While the threat landscape grows and the potential for proliferation to more nations exists, China is the most stressing threat. So I think this stuff is pretty accurate. I think it's pretty important. This document is definitely worth a read. I showed you this graphic on Monday's episode. I've now taken the time to dig into this thing and read it. It's pretty fascinating. Seeking their own advantage, China's increasing space capabilities. China is now the second most active country in space behind the United States in terms of space launch, operational satellites, and capabilities. Consider the Chinese space program's rapid advances by comparing launches of satellites that reached orbit by the US, China, Russia, and all of Europe from 2015 to 2020. During this period, China consistently had more launches than the United States, with a total of 277 versus 274. This comparison is especially compelling considering 45 of the US launches in 2022 were SpaceX launches of its Starlink satellites. In 2022, China placed 45 military payloads in orbit compared to 32 payloads by the United States. These Chinese payloads include intelligence, navigation, communications, and potentially counter space systems, all of which are now integrated into the People's Liberation Army military operation plans. 2020 was not a fluke. It represented a continuation of China's surge into space. Between 2019 and 2021 alone, China expanded its space architecture by more than 50%, resulting in 541 operational satellites. China also plans to directly compete with Starlink by launching a constellation of 13,000 satellites to provide communications and track, monitor, and potentially disable Starlink satellites, according to the Chinese project leader. This last point, the ability to disable a commercial system, is particularly concerning and speaks volumes about China's intent and mindset. Okay, so not kidding about this stuff, right? Leah, if you could look up the Mitchell Institute policy paper and find a link for this. I had it 3 days ago, but 500 links later, I cannot find it. Yeah. So this kind of like puts this stuff in perspective. And again, this is June 2023. This is days old. But you put that in context with the economic developments that Goldman Sachs was talking about in their paper, and you start to see why people are concerned, why people think this stuff is pretty serious. I've been on the inside of this for a little while now, and I'll tell you, it's definitely got my attention, and it has for a while. Okay, give me a second here. We're going to switch gears. Thank you, Leah. Appreciate that. This final piece, so both of these two pieces are really prelude to this document. And this is the one that I said, it came out February, but I only heard about it today. So what is this thing? First of all, anytime you see the Joint Chiefs of Staff seal, you should probably be paying attention to it. This is a document signed by General Miley. He is the commanding general he is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So not to be trifled with, right? If this comes out of his office, this doesn't just affect U.S. Space Force or the Army or the Navy or the Marines or the Air Force. This is all of y'all need to stand up and salute, because this is the direction that we're going. So this is a joint concept for competing. I had not heard of this before. I did not know this thing existed. I read this with fascination today. So let me post a link to it. Really recommend reading this one. It's the most interesting thing I'm going to read today. That's for sure. Give me a second. Let me get the link. It's kind of funny because this thing is buried on the internet. Like, I would have thought that this would have been thanks. I would have thought this would have been like well known, or at least somebody would have said something to it. It kind of surprises me that it's been out for months and I had no idea. So let's look at this thing. What does this thing say? What's it about? Why should it matter? I've been asked before to make it a little bit larger screen. So how's that for everybody? It's okay. Okay. I'm going to read some of the preamble stuff. I got to say, I was not expecting this opening paragraph. Chess has only two outcomes: draw and checkmate. My brother and I, since we were kids, maybe we started learning in the 4th grade, but we started getting pretty good by the 7th grade, to the point where we were competing. Not winning, but competing. Turns out there's a lot of really good chess people, and we were not them. But I've always really liked the analogy of chess, right? So chess has only two outcomes: draw and checkmate. The objective of the game is total victory or defeat, and the battle is conducted head-on in the center of the board. The aim of Go is relative advantage. The game is played all over the board, and the objective is to increase one's options and reduce those of the adversary. The goal is less victory than persistent strategic progress. Wow, that really sunk in. Like that's an analogy that really resonates with me. I have never played Go. I don't know how to play it. I have seen it, and it seems a little bewildering to me. But now I'm kind of interested in figuring out how to play that game. I like the idea of persistent strategic progress. Um, so this document is acknowledging that maybe China and the United States are not playing the same game. And because of that, we're probably at a very significant disadvantage. Um, the beginning of the document starts with this. Our adversaries have studied our military strengths and way of war. Simply put, U.S. adversaries intend to win without fighting. In this context, U.S. challengers intend to pursue their objective while avoiding armed conflict, rendering traditional joint force deterrence less effective. Facing this dilemma, more of the same is not enough. By ignoring the threat of strategic competition, the United States risks ceding strategic influence, advantage, and leverage while preparing for a war that never occurs. If the United States does not compete effectively against adversaries, it could lose without fighting. How crazy would that be that we've put trillions, capital T, trillions of dollars into our national defense and security apparatus, and because we never fired a shot, they never fired a shot, they basically circumvented our military might by going after other technologies, other infrastructure, other mechanisms. That's a pretty interesting. That's a pretty interesting element. I think it was the Maginot Line in World War II. I might be wrong on my placement here, but I think it was the Maginot Line where France built up this really crazy wall, and Germany just decided to go around it rather than to fight up the wall itself. And this kind of feels a little bit like that. For the United States, competition does not always mean hostility and does not preclude cooperation, right? Because we've always kind of played well. Even during the Cold War days of the Soviet Union, we used space as a detente tool. The handshake in space, right? Nor does the United States view strategic competition as an inevitable march to armed conflict. The joint force will expand its mindset to understand the nature of the strategic competition it is engaged in, to focus on advancing our national interests and strategic objectives, to coordinate the military element with other instruments of national power. This is a pretty big change coming from the DoD, coming from the highest levels of the Pentagon. This is a pretty big shift. I was very surprised to see that. It says that, we could buy a lot of tanks, we could buy a lot of M16s, we could buy a lot of aircraft carrier and stealth fighters, but at the end of the day, if those are just sunk costs because we are not in a hot war, how else is the Department of Defense supposed to respond to China's attempt at strategic advantage? I contend that a lot of this goes back to space and Space Force. A lot of this goes back to advanced technology. I think this is one of the reasons why we voted for the CHIPS Act in Congress last year to start focusing on bringing some of our advanced technology that we created, we invented, bringing it back home to the United States. I feel like that's a thing there. And I was at a meeting yesterday, is put on by the Washington State and the local Pierce County. It was an economic development meeting. A bunch of economic partners were there, Department of Revenue, labor and industries, employment security, folks where you have to be compliant. But then also other organizations, women and minority business groups were there. That was great. The thing I was surprised at is there's an agency that I've known for a long time called PTAC, Procurement Technology Assistance Company, I think is what it's called. PTAC, I learned yesterday, is what they do, what they have helped us with is registrations for national bids, like for a NASA proposal or something like that. And they have helped us get our administrative and bureaucratic ducks in a row. They've been very helpful to us. I found out yesterday that they are getting their name changed. They're being called, the new name is called the Apex Accelerators. And they're funded by the Department of Defense. The Small Business Innovation Group at the DoD funds this organization that I've been using for probably 4 years for help on proposals and paperwork. They're a DoD funded program. So I was pretty surprised by that. And it kind of made me think about this piece, right? Joint force will expand its mindset to understand the nature of the strategic competition it is engaged in, to focus on advancing our national interests and strategic objectives, to coordinate military elements with other instruments of national power. Certainly, a thriving American economy is in the best interest of America and the best interest of the Department of Defense. So suddenly the DoD is going to be supporting, not funding necessarily, but supporting small business. I think that's pretty interesting. So there's just the opening page of General Miley's document, and literal, not figurative, marching orders to the other 5 branches of the Department of Defense. This would be one of those days where I'd love to have comments from the audience, because I think it'd be really interesting. This would be a fascinating conversation. I did try to get one of my friends to join our show. It was really short notice. I couldn't make that happen today. But this would be kind of a fascinating conversation with some folks I know. So what is this thing all about? And then specifically, what isn't it? This is a document that advances an intellectual paradigm shift, right? It is saying to the DoD writ large that what we're doing isn't going to work. It's worked so far, but it isn't going to continue working. For the purposes of this concept, strategic competition is a persistent and long-term struggle that occurs between 2 or more adversaries seeking to pursue incompatible interests without necessarily engaging in armed conflict with each other. So 2 organizations, once upon a time it was the US and USSR, and now it's US and China. Incompatible interests without necessarily engaging in armed conflict. So we got one world to share so far. We're probably not going to start throwing bombs at each other. Probably not. I do think that some of the tech, and this is my own personal opinion, not backed up by expertise. I just want to be clear about that. That the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a bit of a proxy war, in the same way that Vietnam was a proxy war once upon a time. And by not admitting Ukraine into NATO, there are really seriously political ramifications to that, and so we're not going to go to war where we're throwing bombs at each other. I really don't think we're going to be doing that with China. I hope sincerely for the rest of the world and for us and for them that we don't ever get to that level. So under the assumption that we're not going to throw bombs at each other, what are we going to do? What are they going to do? I will point out that this document says the normal and peaceful competition among allies, strategic partners, and other international actors who are not potentially hostile is outside the scope of this concept. Nobody thinks we're going to have any competition with Iceland. They're not going to throw bombs. There's no invasion imminent from them to us or us to them. There are lots of nations where this document does not apply. We've got peaceful relationships with Iceland. We consider them a strategic partner, a strategic ally. This document doesn't really apply to them, right? And then just take the list of 200 other nations, 197 other nations, and say, okay, most of them on this list, this document doesn't apply. But to the adversarial threat of China, and probably to a lesser degree, some of the other smaller adversarial nations, this document is really pointed out at one country. I thought this was really interesting, right? That because we had such military dominance, especially in Desert Storm in 1991 and Iraq freedom in 2003, U.S. adversaries responded by seeking to circumvent U.S. deterrent posture through competitive activity below the threshold of armed conflict, right? They saw all that and they're like, yep, we're not going up against the United States directly. We're going to go up against the United States indirectly. And that's pretty interesting. That's pretty telling, right? So if you can't go up against the United States, tank for tank, battleship for, well, not battleship, aircraft carrier for aircraft carrier, how are you going to do it? If you are committed to that level of competition, adversaries aim to achieve their strategic objectives through a myriad of ways and means, including statecraft and economic power, as well as subversion, coercion, disinformation, and deception. I think we have all seen that very clearly, especially over the last few years, especially over our political process, and just how we relate to other nations and other peoples of the world. They are investing in key technologies designed to offset U.S. strategic and conventional military capabilities, i.e. nuclear weapons, anti-access and aerial denial systems, offensive cyberspace, artificial intelligence, hypersonic delivery systems, electromagnetic spectrum. So look at that. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 systems or military capabilities are mentioned here, right? Nuclear weapons, anti-access and aerial denial systems, offensive cyberspace, artificial intelligence, hypersonic delivery systems, and electromagnetic spectrum. This is 7 for 7. This is 7 for 7. All of these systems use space technology. All of these systems use space technology. if there was ever a document that was accidentally aimed at U.S. Space Force, this is it. It doesn't assign these tasks to U.S. Space Force. It doesn't. But all of these military capabilities are, I believe, are in the realm of U.S. Space Force. It's pretty remarkable. If they're not in, they're beside U.S. Space Force. Simply put, our adversaries intend to win without fighting, but they are also building military forces that strengthen their ability to fight and win, right? So if that's what we're up against, we need to have a solid defense. As it says very clearly, facing this dilemma, more of the same is not enough. It's pretty remarkable here. I really do think this document should be getting a lot of attention because it says in no uncertain terms that the role of the Department of Defense needs to change. I would argue maybe this calls for budget adjustments, and that's going to be a fight at the congressional and Senate level, that's for sure. But this says from the highest level of the DoD that what we're doing isn't working and it won't work. The United States must remain fully prepared and poised for war, but this alone is insufficient to secure U.S. strategic interests. If the joint force does not change its approach to strategic competition, there is a significant risk the United States will lose without fighting. Remarkable. The former Joint Chiefs chairman, General Dunford, said, we, meaning the United States or the DoD, we think of being at war we think of being at peace or war. Our adversaries don't think that way. Strategic competition is thus an enduring condition to be managed, not a problem to be solved. That's pretty remarkable. That's I find the language in this document to be makes me a little concerned. But also just the clarity of its messages was powerful. So I really do recommend taking a moment and reading these 3 documents. I know, not everybody likes our policy reviews. I know it. It's true in our numbers. It's true in our comments. It's true in our viewership. But these documents matter, and we're going to continue taking a look at them. There's a lot to this document. It's very dense. I recommend taking the time to review it and try to understand it. And how does it apply to the commercial space sector? How does it apply to the infrastructure we're trying to build in the cislunar satellite orbits, at the Lagrange point, on the moon, the various strategic points at the moon, going further out to Mars and out to the asteroids? Like there's reason that these documents exist, because they're starting to think into the future. Okay, and with that, I'm actually going to close it off for a little bit early today. I went through this stuff a little faster than I expected to. Fascinating reading. It does give you kind of a sobering view of the world, especially given all 3 documents in one sitting. It may be a little disturbing, right? Because that's the world we live in. Okay. With that, I'm gonna sign off. Thanks again to my great team. Sinki, our intern, has returned back home to Korea. So our two interns, that was Eugene Kim and Sinki Kim, they were here for the last several months. They both have returned home. They were terrific people. We really loved having them here. So now is really focused on our core staff of Leah, Rachel, and I to continue building out the Bear Futures. All right. Thanks a lot, y'all. Have a good day. Bye-bye.